The Internet of Things, or IoT, is a physical device network that exchanges data. These devices have embedded sensors, actuators, and software, and often communicate over the Internet. Examples of IoT devices include smart home devices like appliances, thermostats, security systems, and even lighting fixtures. Other examples in a corporate setting include medical and healthcare devices, transportation assets, manufacturing, agriculture, energy management, and even military applications. Security researchers often joke that the S in IoT stands for security. Many IoT devices weren't designed with privacy or security in mind. In this episode, we invite special guests Chris and Casey to the show to discuss IoT cybersecurity. Chris Ruland is the founder CEO of Phosphorous. Chris founded the X-Force team at Internet Security Systems and subsequently co-founded Endgame, Bastille, and Phosphorous. Casey Murphy is the VP of Operations, Strategy, and Marketing at Phosphorous. Casey was formerly a Navy submarine officer and a nuclear weapons policy analyst. He's currently finishing his MBA at Harvard Business School. Casey, Chris, welcome to the show.
Josh, thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, so let's start with the super basics. What is an IoT device, Chris?
Nobody knows. This is a religious question. What is the difference between all these religions? And it is a different conversation with every customer we talk to. But I do feel like we can opine a bit on it because we've been talking to a lot of customers about a lot of things. So the T in IoT is for sure there are a lot of things on their network they didn't know about till they turn the lights on. And so for us, an IoT would be everything I always say, look up, your little Linux computers that are nailed to your ceiling that happen to have cameras, or your HID badge printer that just gave you a new hotel key or a badge to your office, which has a critical CVE in it and no password. So it really runs the gamut of OT connected devices such as elevator controllers, door controllers are one of my favorite, all the way into the IT infrastructure, such as KVMs and lights out management controllers. You wouldn't think that they would be like some of the worst offenders in the world, but they are. And none of them are considered IoT.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I think has brought IoT to so much cybersecurity awareness is that like all of these things are running software these days, right? Like we came from a place where electronics used to be hardwired circuits and switches and transistors and things. And now all of a sudden you've got microcontrollers and systems on module that cost like $5-10, maybe even less. And so now things that, were all of these circuits are now going into software, but that opens up a ton of problems, right? Because as we know, like software you find vulnerabilities in, it's pretty complicated, especially relative to like a hardware circuit. And so if you don't have a good idea of like what's in that software, what kind of vulnerabilities it has, and how do you remediate those problems, you're going to end up with some pretty serious issues, right? So, Casey, what are some of the things that like run software these days that maybe people don't think about as running software?
Man, you get into the gamut there. So Chris mentioned things like, you got your door controllers, your cameras and things like that. But when I'm thinking about like something that's running software, you've got anything you can sign into that you can upgrade that has got a little microprocessor in there, anything that's the size of a Raspberry Pi. You get into these really dangerous issues because you're talking about something that has processing power that you can use for whatever purpose you want as long as you can sign into that thing. So what runs software? It's anything with a computer chip in it when you think about it. And that's what's really dangerous nowadays is people are putting these things in everything, including their refrigerators or their printers or their coffee makers, and they're putting them on the network as well. So yeah, it's overwhelmingly massive.
Yeah, I mean, that's another really good point, right? So it's one thing if these devices run software and become really complicated and maybe have vulnerabilities in them, but it's like a whole nother problem when you start connecting them together and then also to the internet, right? So, Chris, like,
this IoT OT convergence really, since you know DoD well, reminds me of the electronic warfare and cyber guys, right? Sure. Where the EW guys were like, "You don't understand what we do; just leave us alone." And the cyber guys like, maybe this all should go together. And that's kind of the difference between like the IoT guys and the OT ICS guys. And but the second they come into my world is when they connect that RS422 controller to that little dongle with no password on it and has never had a firmware update, and they don't know what a firmware update is.
Right. Like, what are some of the worst offenders of this, like in the enterprise?
Well, I mentioned a few. So what surprised me, like I thought the cameras would be far the worst, and they're pretty bad. Uh, but from a severity perspective, the KVMs just knock it out of the park. So like some of the biggest manufacturers of keyboard virtual mouse switches, right? So this is a virtual thing that puts your hands on a keyboard. They're running Ubuntu that's 10 years old and never been patched, but it's got keyboard access to 32 servers, right? And then on the bottom end of that sandwich, you got your lights out controller, which is like if you ever looked at a server that was turned off and it still has a green light in it, that's because it's got a lights out manager. And those things are little embedded Linux computers too. No one thinks about those. And then kind of the cool stuff, the door controllers are never secured. Clearly they're installed by an installer and they walk out, and that they're break fix guys. So, we found environments where we could open up to 6,000 doors. We typically find in the thousands of critical CVEs and in the thousands to tens of thousands of default credentials in most high security environments.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I mean, it's not because the asset managers aren't like aware of the problem. Sometimes it's just that there aren't the tools available for them to get their arms around this issue, right? If you've got thousands of devices and no idea of what's on them, like what kinds of vulnerabilities there are, and then like any sort of reasonably automated way for you to keep these things up to date, it's like, it's almost a hopeless situation.
It's actually worse than that, because a lot of times they don't know what's on the network in the first place. Because right now, doing an inventory of what's plugged into your network, folks can kind of walk in, and I mentioned the coffee maker or the printer, but like the people who are managing the devices are not necessarily the same people who are managing the security, and they're able to bring these devices online without the security manager having a full inventory of what these devices are. So visibility is actually a huge problem too.
And I mean, like, if visibility is such an issue, like why are enterprises bringing these things into their networks, right? Like you'd think, well, if you don't have a good inventory of like all the different digital assets that you have, why are you buying so many digital assets in the first place? Do they even have a choice?
There's a very long tail on these. A lot of these have been there. They're literally our customers find stuff behind sheetrock. It's been there that long. So looking forward, like what happens with 5G? Someone sticks some 5G behind the sheetrock, like it's going to go forever. So that's like the 10-year-old tail on it. Certainly the newer stuff. The one thing we know for sure is enterprises are never going to use auto update, especially after SolarWinds. Like this auto update is not going to happen, and we got to come up with some tooling. That's what we're working on. Companies like you guys as well, tooling to help our customers secure these little things, because they can't get rid of them. They have to take care of them just like you take care of a pet, like it or not. And feral IoT is like a bad place to be.
Yeah, and they're more like rabbits than dogs, I think. Like,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you were telling me earlier that like there are more IoT devices than PCs by far.
Oh, by far, and more than people, and more than phones. I mean, we've certainly eclipsed the human population several times over when it comes to embedded devices. But like, who's out there actually securing these things? Not many people.
Yeah, and even to expound on that, like the original question you asked is like, why are they doing it? When you've got like Wi-Fi 6, 5G, some of these these low latency technologies that are coming out that are just boosting processing power like crazy. The efficiencies to be gained, like when you think about the first wireless printer that came out, or the first network connected printer, like that was a huge efficiency gain for anybody wanting to print. And those things have been around for what, like 30 years, Chris? So they did all this stuff because it's just boosting efficiency, it's boosting visibility on operations. Like these companies are able to automate all this stuff that wasn't previously automated, and it's for convenience. And so that's not going away anytime soon. In fact, they're going to get more and more creative with how to use these things.
Right. And the OEMs are on the same page, right? Like I know in our world, when we talk about fleet assets, things like aircraft, military weapon systems, maritime vessels, the OEMs, the guys that are making these things, it just makes so much economic sense for them to be cramming them with digital components. If you can replace an analog sensor or an analog actuator with electronics, it's more reliable. the pool of people that you can have to engineer that thing, like software people versus hardware people, a much bigger pool of software folks. And then it's just more reliable, rigorous, and tested. So I think we're going to continue to see more and more digital components getting crammed into basically everything, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but the pool of security people to put on those teams is
not growing at the same rate. No, it's not. Yeah, no, it's not. So, when we think about IT security, obviously it's a pretty complicated space. There are a lot of different kinds of attacks, and there's a lot of different kinds of systems, and a lot of different kinds of like cybersecurity products that are there as control measures to try to figure out ways of defending these IT systems. Like, it sounds like the bar is pretty low, if not on the floor, for like a lot of OT and IoT systems. What are like the biggest kinds of attacks against IoT devices?
Well, I mean, you throw a rock and you're gonna find a flaw in one of the stacks in a IoT device, and we're starting to see more and more of the components being cracked, which is a big problem because a lot of disclosures don't include all affected devices, which makes our jobs really hard. But that being the case, the two biggest attacks, one are default credentials. Just nobody changes these passwords. It just doesn't happen. And the second one is the average age of firmware, like quantitatively from what we see in the field. Also, there's a study from University of Wisconsin. The average half-life of firmware is 7 years. So half the devices after 7 years are still unpatched. So imagine you pulled a Windows laptop out of the closet from 2014 with not a single update and no password, and went down to your local university and got on the network, and how fast are you going to be part of a botnet?
What could go wrong? Yeah,
no, nothing can go wrong. But if you look at these as kind of little Linux and Unix computers, most of the derivatives are, it really looks like kind of like DARPAnet security.
Right. Yeah. So these things weren't designed with security in them in the first place. And
it's almost they were designed to operate in a trusted environment. Telnet's okay.
Telnet's okay, right?
Port 80's okay.
Yeah. Or even Ethernet for that matter, right? Like it's just like the point of it isn't security. It's just like to work, So given that these things are just very compromisable, like what does the anatomy of an IoT attack look like, or maybe a couple of different scenarios?
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest things is around lateral movement. And so we don't get to talk to a lot of bad guys, but we do talk to a lot of pen testers. And the pen testers tell us, okay, last year, 3 years ago, we got the desktops, they put in CrowdStrike. 2 years ago, we came and got the network, they put in Forescout, and they put in AppSec. This year, we're going after the phones and the printers and the things. So this is the new soft target for pen testers, which to me indicates that's the new soft target for bad guys too, because so many resources, at least in the security elite where we initially sell to, they've been locked down for the most part. And but these have had no resources applied to them, even though they compose, say, 30% of the network. So outside, easy to use, high risk, critical CVEs, level 10s, and default credentials, you've got this great opportunity for lateral movement. And people haven't really thought about this, that, okay, all my cameras are PoE, but they also have Wi-Fi stacks in them. They also have Bluetooth on them. So great, I get my own firmware up on the camera. Now I got PoE into your network. I established my own put my own BusyBox on there, got my own Wi-Fi hotspot. Thank you. I'll put it in the lobby. Be nice to get from across the street. So instantly we create a pivot point. And so, I think the guys who run the wireless IDS should know the MAC addresses for all the PoE multi-home IoTs. And they don't, because no one has that fidelity of data. I think the other huge red flag is when I'm looking at customer data, I'm looking for things that don't have host names, because they're almost for sure shouldn't be there. And there are lots of them.
Right. Yeah. But to your point, the fact that there's just like this massive explosion of devices on corporate networks, it's almost like an untenable problem for a lot of IT administrators, right?
Yeah, and because there's been no tooling, right? There's been no HP OpenView or other manager to talk to, a lot of different vendors' devices. And what we did, which was really hard, we spent 2 years doing this, is we abstracted IoT we knew we couldn't build a business supporting every individual thing, but we could support families of things. And so we couldn't support everything in the world, but we could support everything that a regular enterprise used, which is good because that's the bulk of the market. So, for instance, we have a family for Hewlett-Packard, and Hewlett-Packard laser jets for the last 30 years have been on 3 firmware families. That's it. So with 300 lines of code, we can now automate the firmware and credential management for every HP printer ever made. But it took that 2 years of upfront work. Wow. Seriously, you update the firmware with a print job to where we are today to actually being able to secure these devices. And there's been a lot of interest in printer security lately, oddly enough, probably going back to Black Hat 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a bunch of people post stuff about like PostScript is a Turing complete language, and you can like just basically do arbitrary computation on a printer if it like supports PostScript. I mean, it's amazing if you give security researchers like
that'd be a great joint project. We should turn HP printers into Bitcoin miners.
I love it. I love it. Speaking of mining, I mean, like one of the things we've seen over the past decade are these botnets, right? So people will just go on Shodan or like scan the internet looking for devices that are just hanging out on the internet with unpatched firmware or default credentials and like put backdoors on these things, right? Like, what are some of the things people have done with these botnets?
Well, I mean, they took down Twitter, they took down Dyn. I mean, pretty heavy duty stuff, but really just annoyances. I think the only botnet so the Mirai source code's out there, and so there are enterprise editions, if you will, that are built for penetration and exfiltration as opposed to noisy stuff like DOS. Probably the one I saw that was probably the biggest concern was Tarai. And it's a real quiet one. Look, it was all stripped binaries. It runs on, everything going back to Motorola 68,000. So a lot of money went into this. And it's totally deobfuscated, and it uses Tor for CNC. So that's a sneaky little one that we haven't seen a lot, but maybe because people aren't looking for it. Right. And that smells nation state to me.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, so you're talking a little bit about what sorts of defensive tools we have in our arsenal to try to stop some of this stuff. And, I know you guys at Phosphorous are working on like making this insane, insurmountable task of keeping stuff up to date and not having default username passwords just hanging out on your network, like a tenable solution for an administrator who might have thousands or tens of thousands of devices on their network, right? And then a correlated problem to this is like just getting a sense of where those 10,000 devices are. So like if you don't have a good inventory of these things on your network, how do you even begin to get your arms around that problem?
We have the ability to create our own inventory. So that was our product market fit issue as a startup, right? So we're going along we get this ready. We want to do some betas. We're like, okay, let's go. Can you give us a list of your stuff? They're like, no.
Don't you have that list? Is it?
Don't you give us that list? No. So that was we figured that out in 2019. Like, okay, it'd be nice to think as a computer security guy in 2019, everybody has a list of what they have, but nobody does. So that's okay. So we added some inventory capability to then feed what we call an interrogation engine, where we more deeply extract details such as serial numbers, part numbers, end of life dates, other critical data you need to know about things that you don't need to know about computers. Additionally, we had to figure out a way to deal with a new insider threat vector. How do you deal with the insider threat vector on IoT when a guy in a paperclip in 30 seconds can compromise anything? And so we had to put traps around that. And so
this is like factory resetting something, and then
a factory reset. So we can tell if someone does a factory reset, and we'll flag it, roll it up to Splunk or Demisto, whatever, and create a playbook and say, hey, this is a real action. Like someone just messed with this device to put code on here, like
or at least you need to or at least you need to call the IT guy because Bobby had some trouble with the IP cam.
Yeah.
It took matters into his own hands. So how does that work? How do you like go onto an arbitrary enterprise network and
yeah, exactly. So we're software, we're not asking for spam ports, stuff like that. Nobody wants that. An overall thesis these days, if you've done a couple of security startups, you want to solve problems for people, not create lists of work they have to do. And so our thesis was automated remediation. And to do that, they basically run a scan with our product, very lightweight scan. It's not like a vulnerability scan. We're just trying to get identifying assets that are unique. So we've actually never crashed a a host in production. I think I'm the second one in the company to brick something though inside our lab, which I did yesterday, and I got a lot of heat for it. but I'm going to fix that thing after I do. But
with a paperclip.
yeah, if it's in Carlsbad, I got to go to their paperclip. Anyway, so we create this inventory of devices, and then I'd say probably 3 out of 4 devices you can actually abstract a really good identifiable information with no authentication to that device. And we'll try defaults, and then a lot of times, say in retail, it's interesting. In retail in 2019, the retailers, every store they opened, they would ship a pallet of gear, and they would use one password as default that year. Right. And in 2020, they changed the password for every pallet. So that we give them the option to go key in all their latest, defaults, if you will. And then we'll go scan again with those. And we'll usually pretty much enroll just about everything. If not, they can go reset it if they want to. That means they don't have the password for it. And then once those are enrolled, we do 2 things. The first thing we do is we integrate with password management, because we don't want to store passwords. No one wants to store passwords. But everybody that we would talk to probably has a password management solution like a HashiCorp Vault, CyberArk, that kind of deal.
Yep.
So we plug into all those, store the credentials there, and then we're a gateway. So now the passwords get changed every 30 days. Wow. Now all the computers are actually compliant, not just the ones you knew about.
Right. So you're the conduit between all these like existing programs for the IT side and like the IoT device like Farrago that's inside of this network.
Yeah, and tomorrow now they're in compliance. I mean, so this is a really strong move. And then after that, we find that our end users begin to work with the stakeholders. So it's really not IT who owns the cameras, right? It's really not IT who owns the chillers, but they find out who owns them, and then they kind of say, hey, here's how you're going to get your passwords from now on. You got to log into your PAM tool, and we're going to be doing firmware updates because you got critical CVEs. And I'd been away from commercial enough. I didn't realize how serious a critical CVE is. And they are not hard to find on IoT devices. But a critical CVE to a big bank or a defense customer is a serious event. Yeah. Like Zoom calls stop over critical CVE.
Yeah, and emails. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm surprised at how many we find. And I'm also surprised at the massive amount of default credentials. I just didn't really believe it would be that bad, but actually being hands-on this for a year or two, seeing the customer live, it's amazing.
Yeah. So you get an inventory of all of these things, and you go through a process of like regularizing and putting a uniform API basically to all of these things, right? But it seems like the customer doesn't now have to solve that problem, but you do. So how does that work? I mean, you've got the gear of things.
Yeah, we don't have our other lab on here, which has all the rest of our stuff, and it's much neater condition. But we have to keep up. So fortunately, most of what's used as an enterprise is they're like 10 camera vendors they use, right? You don't have to worry about every cheapo camera vendor on Amazon. Which is good. We're not trying to do consumer stuff. We played around with that early. We have an iPhone edition, Android. We kind of paused that. We said, look, let's focus on enterprise because they need it. They enroll these devices, and they rotate the credentials first. And then they'll work with each business unit along the way to say, okay, we're patching all the cameras in Jersey City next weekend. And we've got to find out whatever we missed. And so they kind of leg into that because today, the role of Windows Update clearly belongs in IT. There's a whole team of guys with it stamped on their forehead and says, I'm the Windows Update guy. There's nobody who's got that IT Update guy stamped on their head. And so we're trying to automate that. Longer term, it may belong in IT, but right now it's the security guys who have the exposure. So that's who we think is responsible.
And how does that work? Do you just like buy massive amounts of things and like?
So I would say like along every engagement, we typically have kind of 2 iterations. So we'll scan their environment with what they have, and then we'll find, I don't know, like we found a half dozen Crestron devices that we didn't have support for. We said, well, these are really popular. Okay, we're going to go buy them and add them into our system. So we're kind of experiencing the network effect with multiple customers as every time we run it, we have more and more precise coverage. We'll always be in that 90, as we get to 90, 95% coverage, I'll be really, really happy. I'd say we're 80, 90% out of the box today. And we expect to add, say, 5 new device families per customer. And sometimes we do, sometimes we, only have to add 1 or 2.
Right. And so I guess the idea is like you're buying these devices, you figure out, okay, this is the web interface for how you log in. This is how you upload firmware. Maybe it has an API. And so you're like kind of wiring these devices into a framework and it just all becomes automated. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So that's the creation of the abstraction layers to be able to interact with these family of devices, right? Polycom has one firmware family that actually manages every Polycom device. So we just have to support the one firmware family and QA it against the device families. And the one important thing is that we can actually roll back. And a lot of people don't think about that until, say, SolarWinds.
Yeah,
We
now they
can
are.
do a one-click rollback of 100,000 IoT devices that have a vulnerability. Nobody's ever even thought about building something for that. So
Yeah, not to mention it's hard to find old firmware versions. Sometimes the manufacturers will only have the latest version on their website.
yeah, what happens if the manufacturer goes out of business? Website goes down. So we keep our own CDN. So we keep stuff forever. And as we are customers ourselves of these vendors, right, we have the rights to obtain the software and create a repo.
Sure. Yeah. So like, do you see things getting better or worse or about the same with like the OEMs that are making these devices?
I'd say the same to better. I think for enterprise it's gonna be the same because I think like stuff like an Alexa, right? They're getting better, right? You can't ping this thing. It's all through the cloud. But enterprises, like, they're not going to turn over things to the cloud anytime soon. And they're not going to turn on auto updates anytime soon. They're going to depend on a third-party arbiter to say, I trust this device is safe enough, or unsafe and needs to be removed.
Yeah, I would also, though, I would say that I think we will see some improvements because, like in California, they just passed a law that requires the manufacturers to ship without default credentials. The IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act and the DoD, not the DoD, the federal government, was just passed in December, where every federal agency is going to have to do, manufacturer requirements, which are being set by NIST, and then identity management, patching, and configuration management. And so anybody selling to the federal government is going to naturally have to also include those improvements with their devices. So I think you're just going to see that trickle down in effect into industry where, the requirements around some of this legislation is going to improve the security on these things.
And do you think at some level though, Chris, what you're saying, it's like enterprises are still going to have to manage this process. And so, the fact that an OEM is now randomizing passwords versus giving, default credentials, or is, still making you download firmware from their website and then manually uploading it to the device, like it only goes so far. It like stops the attacker in a lot of ways from like default username password reuse, but it doesn't really help like the asset owner, right? So like, are there standards or things that we need to start thinking about for?
Well, so I've been involved with one called Software Update for Internet of Things, which I think will be good, but it's an ETF process, so it's going to be a 10-year kind of. Right now, we're talking about devices that run with less than 16K of memory, which is not where exploits happen, as you and I know. So once we get up to patching actual OSs that sit on top of those embedded devices. And we're gonna have some microcode issues. I just saw a big Wi-Fi IoT vulnerability. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it? Day before yesterday. Out of those Israeli guys, and I'm sure gonna be a lot of affected devices.
Right, and it's a huge problem. It's not just like Linux, Windows, Mac. It's like you've got little microcontrollers that are running real-time operating systems, or like you said,
it could be your alarm system.
Yeah, right. Like how do you make a standard that works for an Alexa and for an alarm system? I don't know how that happens.
I don't think it's possible. I think there are too many vendors. I think there's a great opportunity for IoT security companies to sell secure OSs. I think Amazon will have a great business there. Like if I was an inventor and I said I'm going to make this IoT machine so I can talk to my dog. I would use a cloud-based OS,
right?
Because that's going to be the most secure, but that's not going to work in an enterprise,
right?
Just as vulnerability assessment has a long tail on it, I think there's going to be a strong need for IoT security, from firmware security to device security, and integration with things like ServiceNow and high-level security management interfaces are going to be key. I think the MSSPs are staying away from this space because MSSPs aren't used to taking action and actually changing things. All right.
Right.
And so they're not in the remediation business. And I think there's an opportunity for the guys, the Tenables, the Qualys, et cetera, to jump into remediation. I think they have to change their business at some point. At some point, people are going to say, okay, our report's not good enough. You got to start fixing stuff for me. Right. And I think companies like Tanium are well positioned there, certainly on the endpoint side.
Right. Yeah. To your point, it's like you have to give people a solution to the problem, not just a whole bunch of work to do. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, alert fatigue is a real thing. And right now, if you're just going to segment quarantine and then give somebody a heads up, hey, 5,000 of your devices are broken, you can take them offline, but it doesn't actually fix them, and it doesn't allow you to have that operational capability back, nor does it really actually secure the device or the data coming from it. So you still got a big problem there. We're like, yeah, we know the problem exists, but we need to do more.
Totally. So a lot of what you're working on is like going into a total mess, basically, and like trying to make sense of that mess. Are there things that, like, say you had, I know this is a rare occurrence, but say you have like a greenfield opportunity to make a new enterprise network or new environment where you're going to have IoT and IT commingling potentially. Like, what are some best practices that IT administrators can use to design a system that's more secure than just like a totally flat network with a bunch of unpatched devices on it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think it's from the ground up is knowing what's on the network and coming up with some kind of computer plan, security plan for each device. And, there's a lot of shadow IoT. If you can remember at the kind of turn of the century, what's your Wi-Fi policy? We don't have any. Really? Because I got 5 bars here. Oh, well, that's the one under my desk. So we got the same thing going on with shadow IoT is people putting stuff in because they don't need the permission of the CIO. They can just go do it. And the CIO can deal with it when he finds out about it, he or she finds out about it. And that's a common issue. Yeah, I think we're gonna have a long tail on this. And but I see friends of mine at very cool companies building brand new facilities, and I hope they're like keeping track of all the stuff. But really, when it comes down to, like, if you're building literally a new office building, like, there's going to be some contractors that don't know anything about cybersecurity installing all the physical access control.
Right.
And people should know that. I've demonstrated for customers opening every door in a building, up to 6,000 doors that could be unlocked with a default password. Talk about blowing somebody's mind.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about it too is that you're seeing a new business model emerge with some of these tech companies where they're going to come in and say, we'll do all of your enterprise IoT for the folks doing digital transformation. So like last year, we saw digital transformation accelerate by like 6 years because of COVID. And so now companies are investing in this stuff where they're like, we want these operational capabilities and efficiencies, and we want them now. So they're just going to come in and overlay this entire network of IoT devices where it will be easier to track from there. But we're still going to see an uptick that is going to require them to scale security. And that's an impossible task to go with if you want to have ongoing security in line with your policies with all these new things coming online.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it also brings up a really interesting point. You mentioned like COVID accelerating a lot of digital transformation. People are now bringing company assets into their homes. And, we've talked a lot about enterprise IoT, but people have IoT crawling all over their houses as well. And like, there are not solutions. I mean, at least as far as I'm aware, there's not solutions out there for homeowners to take control of these IoT devices, which are, if not as vulnerable, more vulnerable than a lot of the stuff that gets sold into enterprises. Like,
we think about that a lot. And, we did start off thinking about consumer and build applications there. I think, once we see a customer who's locked down their enterprise IoT first, I think they'll start asking for that. And when they do, we'll be able to deliver it. I think it'll be important. I think the market's too early right now, because I don't think consumers will actually pay for this themselves. And there is a much more diverse environment of things in a consumer environment than there are in an enterprise. Like one of the things we didn't talk about is from the manufacturer malicious. And that's a thing. So we had a case, the Uoku security camera, Amazon choice camera from 2017 to 2019. It shipped out of the box. When you hit mute, it turned on an audio stream to China. It would also upload Nmap scans of your LAN to a honeypot in China. So for 2 years, if you're like a civilian you're going to pick the Amazon choice camera, I'm sure there are a lot of them out there doing bad things.
Yeah, it's horrifying, actually. But it sounds like there might be a path for example, people who are working from home with corporate devices. Maybe at some point in the future,
Exactly.
the business would pay, hey, we're gonna like just make sure that there's some sanity around
Yeah, so
your
like
home environment.
so one route would be like put us in the App Store marketplace for the endpoint solution, and then we can scan the LAN environment and say, hey, there's like 2 critical CVEs and 3 defaults that need to be rotated. Otherwise, you should limit this LAN connection.
Right.
So that's a great IoT security play, and I think one that reflects the current hybrid work environment.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds like devices are going to continue coming out. Like, is it a legislative thing that we need to do to like get manufacturers to take basic cybersecurity principles seriously? I mean, the California legislation, is that?
I actually like this new law, at least as it pertains to federal, because within 2 years, you legally actually have to patch and change passwords on IoT devices, which is a good thing. And also, I happen to have a business that patches and rotates IoT credentials. So that's the first time in my life I've actually seen legislature that kind of made me clap.
Right.
Generally, I think legislature getting involved in innovation is not a good idea. And it's just like how if operating system vendors had to be guarantee the security of their operating system before they could sell their operating system, we'd never get one.
Right.
And so there has to be some risk taken, and as the cost margins are slim on IoT security is going to be something that's cut until we get to the point where people make selections of products based on security as a feature. And you could say the different mobile phones offer different security features, and people may select their mobile phone based on, hey, I want something really secure versus I want something more flexible.
If you go even one step beyond that, like if you're going to call manufacturers to do their own security, you're asking people who aren't experts in security to do security. And, as Chris mentioned, like it's just going to grind innovation to a halt. So if you can put the onus on the other side is you don't want people outside the enterprise being responsible for enterprise security. I mean, if I'm a CISO and I'm putting devices online and I'm going to say, well, the manufacturer's got this, I don't need to worry about the security. That doesn't sit well with me. So I think, bringing in companies who do know security and who can actually effectively and scalably secure these things, I think that's going to be more on the move. So they should set the requirements to say, yeah, you need to patch. Yeah, you need to rotate credentials. Manufacturers, you should have some basic requirements in place because you know enough about this to at least turn on or off this port or disable Bluetooth if it's not necessary, yada, yada. But I think really, the enterprise is going to want control over this. And so if they're going to do smart legislation like they just did, then I think, putting those requirements and then letting the experts do what they do is kind of the market efficient way to do this.
Right.
If I could ask you something, Josh, I'm curious. On an engagement, have you ever not found a vulnerability?
Never. Yeah, it's a matter of how long and how bad. That's really the way we measure engagements.
Yeah, I mean that's the way ours is today. And like if you look at like the rest of the computing world, there's a pretty good chance you could get out of an engagement and not find a vulnerability. But in our world, it's like, yeah, how much time do you have? And how bad do you want it to be?
And how bad do you want it to be? Like what, are you trying to prove a point to somebody, or do you, Yeah, it's just, I mean, we saw this in the military. It's like when OEMs, the big defense players build these technologies, there are requirements in place. The government says, okay, the tank's got to be able to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. No one wrote cybersecurity requirements into these things. No one even thought like, who's gonna want to hack a tank? Isn't it just easier to like send a missile at it or something like that? And so the result is this whole industry grew up around building technology with tons of digital components in it with zero cybersecurity requirements. And it got so bad that the government outed itself. Like in 2018, there was this big report.
Well, I would think it is better to hack a tank than it is to shoot one, right? It's probably a lot cheaper.
It's a lot cheaper. It's
just
a lot
send
cheaper.
Packets.
It's just send packets. And then not only that, but like it scales, right? So if you can find an access vector, like, we plug all kinds of shit onto like our weapon systems. We plug, maintenance support devices onto these things. Believe it or not, munitions, like things like a missile or a fuel pod, they connect directly onto the main control bus of these assets.
So your supply chain is now as weak as your gas tank.
You got it. You got it. So you can, you could probably permeate an entire fleet with a lot less effort than, trying to shoot all those things down,
Well, I think there's some interesting joint opportunities for us.
I think so too. And I think there's a lot of crossover in industrial IoT is a buzzword that we hear a lot. I mean, you've got these like very expensive manufacturing assets, and it's not just a cybersecurity problem. So like the operators of these things are, I guess, like very concerned about keeping uptime. And so in that respect, like as attacks become more and more common, they're going to be worried about, okay, I need to make sure this thing doesn't get attacked because it costs me $100,000 an hour when my factory is down. But the other thing that's interesting is there's an interplay here with like the right to repair movement, right? So there's this idea that all these devices are generating data, and that's an opportunity not only to like monitor it for cyber attack and like try to make sure that it's not compromised. It's like that defense in depth type of thing, but also to take that data stream, the data streams that are coming off of these IoT devices and pull them back so that the business owners can use that data to be smarter and safer. Right. So we have like examples in the manufacturing.
It's really interesting. We actually just had, I think a week ago, a very large tractor dealer asked us to manage the IoT on the tractors. So I'm well familiar with the fix it yourself movement,
yep.
and this is gonna be. I'm excited about this one because it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah.
We're gonna do it with or without OEM help.
Yep.
We're gonna secure the customer at the end of the day.
Well, and legislation is going to be on your side. I mean, I know there's a big food fight over the data that's getting generated off of these things, especially in the agricultural space. To your point, there's been a bunch of documentaries about this. I can't remember which state passed legislation, essentially corollary to like the copyright Digital Millennium Copyright Act type stuff for security researchers, where it says like, hey, you own this asset, and like if it's generating data, you have a right to collect that data and use it for your own purposes.
Yeah, it was a John Deere lawsuit, and
exactly.
And the researchers prevailed. So I think it's going to be interesting because obviously there's a lot of IoT going on in these new places, and I never thought in my life I would have a tractor reseller call me and ask me for my product.
It's crazy. It's a crazy world we live in, but it's a testament to how the more you put software and hardware onto things, like you're bringing them into the 21st century, and there's all these like use cases and different ways of like maximizing maintenance and operations that like no one would have thought of 30 years ago, because like we were thinking a PC costs $5,000 and it's like, it's 50 pounds and you got a CRT monitor and all this stuff, where now like you can get a microcontroller the size of your thumbnail. It's more powerful than those PCs were. Mm-hmm. And it costs $5.
Yep. It's a crazy world, and I hope next time we can talk about 5G, because I think 5G is going to be like putting gas on a fire when it comes to all this IoT that's going to come out on 5G. It's going to be crazy, and that's actually going to be in our face. That's not going to be stuffed in an enterprise.
Totally. Tell me about it. Like, what are some of the differences between 4G and 5G, and how does it enable?
Well, 5G is going to be always on and very high bandwidth.
Yeah.
And devices will be baked in with it. So, why even worry about Wi-Fi when I can get 5G and just walk out of the store with it and it's on? I just got to swipe my credit card and I got a subscription. And so any bad guys traversing a 5G network are going to be able to find these things and potentially exploit them. I mean, it's the number 2 seconds. It is the second sentence in the D&I CTO's paper on 5G says, our number one concern is IoT device security on 5G environments. So we see that as a big greenfield as well, and moving to that from Wi-Fi 6.
With 5G in general, the lack of latency now, like they've reduced it to like 0, which is pretty incredible. So I think with that, like you were saying, we've already seen like smart cities and those environments come about. And when you have more and more devices, I think if you can even call it that, like the entire networks of traffic lights and all this other stuff that's like a critical infrastructure for cities, all that stuff coming online provides all these crazy opportunities as well. And there's this crazy article about dude hacked, I want to say it was like every camera in Russia, every traffic cam in Russia, so it's just free surveillance, and this is public information. He just threw it up on the dark web and said, hey, if you guys want to see every camera in Russia and what it's showing, or maybe it was just Moscow, actually not Russia. But bottom line is, like, things like that, it gets pretty scary pretty fast if you're not going to actually secure those devices and actually secure the data.
Right.
which creates huge problems. But yeah, with 5G, you're going to see a lot more stuff like that too, where your cities are moving to being digitally connected.
Especially if these things are on the internet, right? Like it's one thing, we've been talking a lot about stuff that exists on an enterprise network. It's like natted behind some router firewall somewhere. So there's at least like one layer of effort that a person needs to go through to like be able to get access to these devices. But if something's hanging out on like 5G internet connection, like we mentioned Shodan, but like basically like there are these search engines where the folks are scanning the entire IP space and looking for devices that are out there and fingerprinting them. I mean, it's just going to get way worse.
Well, and imagine the dark web version of Shodan. That must be just amazing.
Right. Yeah. Someone makes the black hat version of what you're making, and connects it to Shodan or the black. Yeah. I mean,
it's easier for the bad guys right now because it's like there's no game warden in town.
Right. I mean, I know, Chris, you've got a lot of people in your network that do red teaming and pen testing. Like, how often are red teamers using IoT devices as part of their attack chains?
It's a new trend, just as people actually caring about it is a new trend. So we see right now the security elite. So we're working with some of the top banks in the world, like top 5, top 10 financial institutions in the world, and then DoD. And that's kind of who our customer types are, which are security elite. And there are lots of those guys. And they want to take care of this problem before they get hit. And I think it'll roll just like anything else. Nobody had gateway. If you remember Melissa, the day there was no email in 1998, right, nobody had gateway antivirus the day before Melissa, and the day after Melissa, everybody had it.
Right.
So when we have that IoT Melissa moment, there might be an IoT guy in the IT department.
Right.
I've only seen it in one company. I've seen a director of IoT in one company, and I don't even know if that person knew what their job was.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like IoT devices, the other thing that's really interesting is some of them manipulate like the physical world, right? Like they've got actuators on them. It's not just sensors. IT systems are like there to move information around for the most part, but IoT devices, like, they can have ramifications in the physical world. And, the thing I'm really worried about is it's going to take events like, Melissa, or you've had, like worms and things that like, raise awareness for people to take these issues seriously. Like the thing I'm worried about is there's going to be some large scale IoT attack against some system that's like critical or dependent on, that people depend on, and there's going to be like loss of human life.
So what's interesting about that is the FBI actually did an experiment. I want to say it was like 2012 or something like that. They knew about this early on when they started looking at a lot of these industrial devices coming online, and they actually tried to see if they could hack a turbine and overspeed it, and they succeeded. And so when we're looking at some of the critical infrastructure stuff, that's actually what got me into this space in the first place, coming into submarines, because I realized that when beautiful thing about submarines, we're water gapped, we're good, but when you're looking at some of the critical infrastructure, you get into really big problems in terms of these industrial actuators and things like that, with whether it's valves or you name it. And if you send the wrong alerts or you send the wrong signals to any of those things, you can have a very large physical impact on, power plants, et cetera. And I think it's a well-known problem, which is why I'm okay saying it. But yeah, it's definitely one that's a scary one if we don't take care of it.
It sure is.
I mean, we've got this breaking news where these guys tried to put lye in the water supply in Tampa through the ICS at the water facility. I mean, this is like happening in real time. And if you're doing the Super Bowl, in my opinion, that's not testing. That's like production live. Right. That was a real attack trying to hurt people. Yeah. So, it's happening under our noses.
Right. Yeah, it's really really upsetting, and it's good to hear that people are working on these problems. At least I think unfortunately it probably is going to take some events like this to raise awareness around the problem and get people to act. But I'm hopeful that we're headed in the right direction. You see manufacturers starting to take it more seriously. I think ultimately for consumers and for enterprise, it's going to take them developing a discerning kind of opinion around the security of their devices. But I'm not even really convinced that that happens elsewhere, right? Like Apple devices are pretty secure, but like, are people buying Apple devices because they're secure, or are they buying Apple devices because they're Apple? I don't know.
Probably some of both.
It's probably some of both.
It's it'll be interesting to see what direction this industry takes. I think the U.S. enterprises and we're seeing an interest in EMEA and Asia as well want to find a baseline. Where are they right now, and what can they do to shore up the biggest gaps? And then what's the plan going forward? So there are a lot of holes that need plugging, and because the scale of IoT and kind of what we call technical debt in our companies, right? The technical debt of these IT organizations with these devices that haven't been maintained, it's really impossible to resolve that manually. So as companies like ours and others emerge that provide tooling to help automate those problems and solve them, we can offer solutions instead of just telling people about a problem they can't solve.
Right. Yeah, you got to be solution oriented, right? Ultimately, we're here to solve problems rather than just complain about the state of security.
Well, yeah, and that's it's in the visibility space, you do get some of that where, okay, I got to list all these devices. Now, what do I do with them? And right. We like that because we'll ingest that data.
That's
and
right.
Spit out the solution.
There you go. That's right.
What's cool about the way that we're moving with this is that, like, if you've got a scalable security backbone, then you can build whatever IoT infrastructure you want on top of it. And it's not that you don't have to worry about that, but you reduce the attack surface sufficiently and do the risk mitigation sufficiently that you can scale IoT with peace of mind, which is great. Like, you get all these capabilities instead of having to think, well, if I put 10 more devices on, that's 10 more I have to manage, as opposed to automating the solution, in which case you can say, all right, let's go. Like, let's throw thousands on, because it's going to have all these new things that we can do for our businesses. And they can do it knowing that their security team's got their back.
Gotcha. Well, Chris, where can people find out more about you and Phosphorous and what you're working on?
Phosphorous.io is our website, and my own email is just chris@phosphorous.io. Happy to take feedback, good or bad, or indifferent. And certainly, anybody wants to talk about taking a look at what we're doing, we're happy to show you. And I can guarantee you it is something you have not seen before.
Awesome. Well, Chris, Casey, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Planes, Trains, and Tanks. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review. To learn more about Shift5 and our products, visit our website at shift5.io or follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.